Oysters.
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 Oysters. Oysters. The love of my life. So we're going to discuss some oysters today. I truly love oysters and really love how the industry has evolved over the past decade. When I first started buying the oysters at Samuels and Son, we literally had like 4 different types. At that point, people were buying Blue Points, they were buying Chesapeake Bays, they were buying Malpecs, and every once in a while we'd get something in from the West Coast and they would bring in like a Chef Creek or something like that. People didn't really understand what the point of having varieties are. In fact, still today, people don't really understand what the point of the varieties are, because if you look at like the East Coast, you see Virginica. Right, so Virginica is the scientific name for the oyster that runs from all the way up at the Maritimes in Canada, all the way down and around the Gulf of Mexico through Texas. So that's what's called a Virginica. So that's a Blue Point, that's a Chesapeake, that's an Apalachicola down in Florida, that's all the way up to a Malpec in Prince Edward Island. They're all the same oyster, but they're not. So you talk about a Blue Point on the Long Island Sound, a lot of salty water, a lot of current, a lot of nutrition, so you get a big, hearty, salty oyster. You go down to the Chesapeake, it's a little more brackish, which means there's a little more freshwater influence there coming in into the bay. So you get a less salty, more sweet oyster. There's even river oysters, like the Rappahannock River out of Virginia, that'll have a much more sweet profile. You go up into the Prince Edward Island area, a lot of those oysters have more earthy type tone to them, and that's basically because of the clay deposits that are built up in Malpeque Bay. And that's just the Virginica oysters. So we started bringing in things like the products from Rhode Island or from Wellfleet, Massachusetts, or even from Maine, and the variety train got rolling. The Jiga species that came from China originally, that made its way over the United States on the bottoms of boats. Olympia oyster, which is native to the west coast of the United States. You have the Virginica that is native to the east coast of the United States. And then you have the European variety, the European flat, sometimes known as the Boulogne, which originates from the Boulogne River in France. Another species that is brought in is from the west coast, and that's the Kumamoto, also known as the Sakima species, that's originally from Japan. So little by little, we went from having 4 varieties to having like 30 varieties to having 40 varieties. Now currently we have like 72 different varieties of oyster, which is insane, but wonderful for anybody who's into oysters as much as I am. And you could just walk in every morning and, instead of having a cup of coffee, just shoot down 6 of those, fill your electrolytes up, and get your day going. It also freaks out some of the staff, which is always nice.
Hello, Kat. Welcome to Taste Kitchen. We're going to be tasting some oysters today. I have a few examples here of East Coast and West Coast oysters. We actually have 2 West Coast and 1 East Coast. Have you ever tried that many oysters before?
No, I actually haven't.
Okay, well, now you get an opportunity today.
Awesome.
So we'll start with the East Coast, and we'll have you try everything just as it is here. Taste the oysters. East Coast tend to be a little bit more approachable. They taste like seawater. They tend to have a briny flavor up front, which is that seawater taste I was telling you about. And also, when you open an oyster, actually, why don't I get into that for you?
Definitely.
Show you what I do when I open an oyster. First thing I do is when I open an oyster, I'm going to look at the oyster itself, and you're always going to see a long side and a short side. Okay? Oysters only have one abductor muscle, and they tend to be over towards the short side, and about 3/4 of the way up the shell, it's going to be about right here when I open this up. So that's the major thing you really want to cut and make sure it's nice and clean when you're opening your oyster. So, first of all, you want to be sure you're safe and always have a rag on you. Wrap your oyster well in the rag. And I take my knife and I get it into the hinge here. Once I'm into the hinge, I give it a twist and that pops the hinge. And then I take my knife and clean it off, of course, slide it along the top shell, and cut that abductor muscle.
Do you always go from the bottom of the shell versus...
Generally, there are some oysters that say to open them from the front. They tend to have softer shells, and you can kind of dig in. But for the most part, I open all my oysters from the hinge. So we'll open one more for you here just so you can see how I'm opening. Again, I'm going to get my knife into the hinge there, get it securely in there, and give it a twist. That's going to open up my oyster. Clean off my knife, take it and glide it along the top shell. That shell broke. not a big deal. Just make sure we get rid of that, and make sure we don't leave any shell fragments behind. Again, I'm going to cut that abductor muscle. Make sure I don't have any shell fragments still stuck in here. Now, like I was saying before, East Coast oysters tend to have briny flavor up front, almost tastes like seawater. And then the finish tends to be a little bit grassy or cucumbery. So I'm going to hand this one over to you, Kat.
Okay.
And you can tell me what you're getting out of this oyster.
Okay. Should I chew it or should I just swallow
Yeah, you
it?
should chew it a little bit. I usually like to put it in my mouth, chew it a couple times, and you'll see that as you chew it, a little bit of sweetness will come out. I'll take that shell from you.
Thank you.
Sure. Usually about 3-4 chews into it, I really start to notice a change in the oyster. So it gets salty up front, and then
Yeah,
why don't you
definitely.
describe it? Yeah, then there's a little bit of sweetness as you chew on it.
That's pretty good.
Want to tell me what you tasted there? Like I said, it was salty up front?
Yeah, it was definitely salty, and then it went more into a sweet.
Uh-huh.
And then I just definitely tasted the grassy finish.
Grassy, a little bit of cucumber?
Yeah. Does each oyster vary by the area they're from?
Absolutely. Oysters are very much like wine. And they carry on their terroir, which is where they're grown, and the flavor of where they're grown is really unique to that individual type of oyster. So yes, there are many influences that go into the flavor of oysters, such as what they're feeding on, the temperature of the water, and whether it be East Coast or West Coast.
Popular question is, when do you eat oysters? Because traditionally you hear you shouldn't have oysters unless the month has an R in it, or at least that's the old adage. Is adage the right word?
I think so.
Adage is the right word. And that was a great tool before refrigeration. But nowadays, with refrigerated trucking and much better standards, even on the farms themselves, you can have an oyster pretty much all year round. Enjoy your oysters 365. I know I will.
The next one I'm going to give you is a West Coast oyster. We're going to give you an Emerald Cove here. As you can see, this oyster is significantly different than the East Coast oyster that we just
Definitely
made.
much smaller.
Much smaller, much rounder, has a much deeper cup to it, as the Pacific oysters tend to be. They also tend to have this fluted edge to them, as you can see. These aren't that heavily fluted, but they tend to have a little bit of a rippled or fluted edge.
So that's how you can tell the difference between them.
That's one of the secondary characteristics. But generally, the shape and the size and the deep cup on them kind of give away their West Coast oyster. West Coast oysters are in colder water, so they tend to have a little bit more fat going on. So the flavor changes a little bit. These tend to have almost a little bit of a creamy flavor to them. And then you can also pick up on that grassy, cucumbery, and then they West Coast have a little bit of a zinky note at the end too. So I'll give you another one of the West Coast to taste, and you can tell me what you taste and the difference there, as opposed to what I described. So this is one of the Emerald Coves.
Let's see here. It's definitely a lot more saltier.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I do taste the middle of the end.
Mm-hmm. You get a little bit of a creaminess to it in the fat there. Yeah.
And that
Those
has
are
to
the
do
general
with-
differences between the East Coast and West Coast oyster. Yeah.
Does that metal taste have to do with the deep cut, or is that just because of
No,
the...
that's just the way it's grown, the type of oyster it is. They tend to have a little bit of a metallic flavor at the end. The Emerald Coves are very much a West Coast oyster. Something that's a little bit more approachable are Kumamotos. They're also West Coast oyster, but they're a slightly different species. They tend to be a little bit more mild than most of the other West Coast oysters. So I'm going to feed you one of those as well. And as you saw with the Emerald Cove, it's still the same basic technique, opening up either a West Coast or East Coast oyster. Again, I'm just going to stick my knife into the hinge, put my towel over top of it so I don't hurt myself, pop that hinge, and then I'm going to cut the abductor muscle on the top shell. This is a smaller oyster, so it's harder to work with. And if you throw them around, sometimes they give it up a little bit easier. Not always, though. Yeah, we'll still get this open, but it's not going to look quite as pretty. So it seems that we lost a good percentage of our bottom shell here, unfortunately. I'll put that off to the side and open another one here. Oysters tend to be raised in turbulent waters. And the more turbulent the waters, and the more the oysters are tumbled.
Oh, okay.
So what they will do is they'll put them in big boxes in the surf and let them roll around a little bit in the turbulent water, so that as they hit things, the shells become sturdier. The shells break off a little bit, and it creates a much stronger shell for the shellfish. So this is a Kumamoto. This is going to be a little bit more mild than the Emerald Cove, but it's still going to have those West Coast characteristics. You can give us a hint of what you're tasting there.
Yeah, definitely not as salty. I can see the mildness. And not as metally as
Yeah.
I would say either. It's good. It's kind of almost similar to an East Coast one.
It's a little bit kind of in between. It's a little bit more
I can
mild.
see.
Right, yeah.
That's good though.
We talking about size? No. So the question of size, where you'll have oysters that are relatively close to each other from a geographical standpoint, but that the oyster will range drastically in size. Well, that has to do with when you want to bring the oyster to market. If you leave the oyster in the water, it will continue to grow. Typically, people leave oysters in the water for about 3 years. After 3 years, they would bring them to harvest. But if you leave it in the water longer, it'll continue to grow. And there's a demand for larger oysters, whether you're going to grill them or stuff them or bake them. Also, warmer waters will play a part in that too. So oysters that are from down south, around the Gulf, they'll grow a lot faster because of the water temperatures than something that, say, from Maine. So you have your small cup oyster, you have your mediums, your large cup. And basically that's just the diameter of the oyster and the depth of the oyster.
Just to show simple applications of how universal oysters are, I have a simple dish here that we're going to do. We're just going to do a poached oyster. And we're going to poach it actually in the shell. So I have a liquid over here that is a little bit of green tea, some ginger, some lemon and lime, and a little bit of ponzu sauce that I brought up to a boil here. And it's at a simmer now, so about 180 degrees. And I'm going to do one East Coast and one West Coast. And we'll poach them right in the shell. And I'll show you how easy it is to work with oysters here and add a little bit of different flavor and give them a little bit more depth. So I'm going to open up one of these East Coast. Again, right at the hinge. Make sure I pop my hinge, get that out there. I'm going to remove my knife, make sure it's clean. Slide it along the top membrane. Try to keep my oyster as whole as possible. And then I'm going to cut the abductor muscle underneath. And there we have a clean released East Coast oyster. I'm going to do the same with one of the West Coast oysters, the Emerald Coves here. And then we're going to poach both these right in the shell.
Do you always poach them in the shell, or can you do it?
No, this is just
It's
an
a
idea
type
of what.
way.
Oh yeah, one way of doing it. Makes a nice presentation, especially a tableside presentation. It's a little fun thing you can do for the guests to see the oyster being poached right in front of you. Is a lot of fun. I always enjoy having people watch their food being cooked. So we have the East Coast and the West Coast there, and you'll see that oysters are so delicate that they cook very, very quickly. So we're just going to take a couple spoonfuls of liquid over top, and we'll let this run a little bit. You can see that oyster is starting to change color a little bit. I do have a little bit of dirt left in here. You can see it's tightening up a bit and changing color. That's the reaction from the heat. You'll see I have a little bit more liquid than I really need in there, so that's fine. It takes a minute or two to poach. Add a touch more in, and then I'll hand these off for you to taste.
That's all it takes to poach?
That's pretty much it. Yeah, they only take about a minute or so.
Wow.
So we'll take these out of the excess poaching liquid. That one lost a little bit of its liquid, so I'm going to add a touch more in. Just going to garnish them with a touch of parsley on top of each one, make them look pretty. And here we have tableside poached oysters with a little bit of ponzu and citrus. And give them a try, Kat. Let me know what you think.
Let's see. So we have the Chincoteague and
Yes, so you have the East Coast, which is Chincoteague, poached with a little bit of ponzu citrus. And then you have the Emerald Cove, which is the West Coast.
okay. Let's start with the East Coast.
Should have changed the texture a little bit, made it a little bit meatier.
Yeah, definitely. That's
How's the flavor on that? Very nice? Yeah.
Definitely changes the flavor of the oyster, but in a good way.
What are you picking up from there? You get a little bit of citrus?
I'm definitely tasting lemon lime.
Ginger in there?
Definitely.
Goes nicely with the oyster.
It pairs very well.
Excellent.
I
Why
like
don't you try
that a
that
lot.
West Coast, and that should work out well as well.
Let's see.
I think the West Coast change even more as they're cooked,
Oh,
as a
wow.
matter of fact.
I don't taste that metally thing, metally taste anymore. Definitely not salty. I think that paired really nicely with
Yeah,
the West
nice
Coast
and meaty.
one.
Yeah.
So creamy.
Yes. Yeah.
Those are awesome.
I really enjoy oysters, and you can see it's very, very simple to work with them, and it's a really nice way to start off a meal.
So there are some wild species still left out there. For the most part, it's all done through aquaculture now. It's so easy to grow oysters. There's such a demand for oysters. They're so great for the environment. They do wonderful things for the ecosystem. So why not just grow them farmed? You really put the seed in the water and let it grow. There are also techniques that you can use with some of these oysters where they will shift them in the water so that they don't develop what's called that banana shape. But the oysters that have that deeper cup are manipulated and positioned in certain ways where the oyster will grow deep as opposed to being grown long. For Virginicas, they tend to be a more simplistic flavor. You'll get a sweet to salty type spectrum with little hints of things like earth minerals or whatnot. But when you go over to the west coast of the Jaga species, there tends to be aftertones, things like fruit or vegetable-like finishes. You'll also go with like Olympia or European flats where they tend to have a metallic aftertaste. So you'll actually get the sweet and salty, you'll get the fruity undertones, but then you'll also have an aftertaste of like say copper or other type metallic-like flavors. Quick little story, my first oyster was about 23 of age. I was overseas visiting my family. And here I'm this big seafood big shot from the United States. And, you know, they're all trying to impress me. And obviously, I guess I was trying to impress them because I never had an oyster before. And not only did they pull out an oyster on this boat we were hanging out at, but they pull out the biggest oyster I've ever seen in my life. It was literally about the size of my forearm. It was a Tasmanian oyster. And it was gigantic. And they're all just slurping them down. And I've never even had one before, you know. For me, I mean, I've had a bunch of seafood at that point in my life, but never really got into the raw oysters. So, you know, as they're slurping them all down, they're putting like ginger on it or whatever it may be. And they hand one over to me, and I slurped the whole thing down and immediately fell in love.
January, February, March, not May.
Not May.
Not May.
May's not as an art.